ready, that is already of strong interest. It's really the final stages of bankability. In addition to those things, we offer what's referred to as political risk insurance, so for example, coverage against expropriation. Very quickly, thank you for the clarification. For purposes of our operations, we have an existing portfolio of about $40 billion. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Just one further. Yes, thank you. So about $40 billion portfolio. Last year we did $2 billion in business just in sub-Saharan Africa. As you can see, it's our largest regional portfolio at this point. Next slide, please. With regards to project eligibility, there are various criteria. The first is to make sure that it's a private sector project. It has to be majority owned and controlled by the private sector, high social and environmental standards, as I mentioned, a positive development impact for the host country, and then if there are any prohibited sectors. I know that within your Chamber of Commerce there's a high representation of textile companies. Unfortunately, textiles, because of the trade sensitivities, is not something that we can typically do. But as you'll see, there are a lot of other sectors that we are involved in. Next slide, please. So, along those lines, the key sectors for us nowadays are infrastructure and critical minerals, roads projects, ports projects. When we refer to critical minerals, it's a list of about 50 minerals designated by our government. So those are things like lithium, graphite, any key minerals going into electric vehicles or batteries. Then food security and agriculture, which is primarily a matter of processing. Healthcare, of course hospitals, but also medical manufacturing. And then small business and financial services, which typically means supporting financial institutions so that on an indirect basis we can support oftentimes women-owned companies or small, micro and small and medium enterprises. Next slide, please. We also have a couple of cross-cutting priorities, such as climate finance and then economic empowerment, which oftentimes means support to women entrepreneurs. Next slide, please. This slide merely points out the degree of representation that DFC has in Africa. So we currently have about 8 people, 3 of whom are in Johannesburg, 3 in Nairobi, 1 in Lagos, and 1 in Dakar, and more to come. Next slide, please. A few brief examples here. I won't go through those in detail because I really want to retain the time for the questions. So next slide, please. Next slide. Next. 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 And here's the contact information. Because I know we're short on time, I want to be able to answer any of your questions. So I will open up the floor to that. Please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Jacob. Thank you for sharing that. Earlier you mentioned prohibited industries. Are there any information more in detail regarding that that we can look into so that we can actually look into what suits us?
Of course. Yeah, great question. I think the main ones to bear in mind, they don't necessarily fall under the category of all prohibited, but things that are trade sensitive for the United States, such as textiles or steel, are typically industries that we avoid. Other things, to bear in mind are kind of, the sin industries, alcohol for the most part, we don't really support. But almost everything else is open. So tourism, depending on the development impact, is certainly open. As mentioned, energy, power, transport, ICT, medical, healthcare, agribusiness, all of those industries are very open and cases where we're eager to support things. One thing that I noticed in that is not in the presentation is kind of our minimums with regards to a loan size or check size. So essentially we're looking to support projects for the most part that are where the check size for us would be about $10 million. So in rand terms, roughly 200 million rand.
In US dollars. And number 2, I think critical for us to know what is the interest rate. And thirdly, what is the normal length, duration of the loan, please? Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. Those are in dollars, and with repayment in dollars. There are certain exceptions to that. As a development financial institution, we seek to do as much as possible in what is referred to in acronyms as the LICs and the LIMICs, the lower income countries, lower middle income countries. In South Africa, we support projects that are involved in the just energy transition, for example. We also support projects related to women's empowerment. But again, we seek to do as much as possible the likes of Mozambique or Kenya or Zambia, some of the other markets where your chamber is open. I would point out though that we don't simply do loans. We can do political risk insurance as well. Many of you may be familiar with the coverages that are offered by MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which is part of the World Bank. So the coverages that we can offer for that are very similar. In addition to straight loan or debt financing, we can also provide guarantees of different types in order to facilitate financing occurring. So in certain difficult markets, such as Nigeria, there are various forms of guarantees that we can provide in order to facilitate local currency lending. Not something that we would usually do in the South African market, although depending on the project, we could consider that. To go back to some of the other points, the tenor or the length of the loan is one of the aspects of flexibility, that's kind of our competitive advantage. In principle, we can go up to 20 years or even longer as necessary. Usually that's when things are backed by a long-term contract of some kind, such as a power purchase agreement. So if there's a PPA, power purchase agreement of, let's say, 15 years, then we could provide, a loan tenor of almost that period of time. We would look for, what's referred to as a tail of 2 to 3 years. But it's not just in power. In the mining sector as well, we can go up to, considerably long tenors, depending on the offtake contracts that exist. On the question of the interest rate, it very much depends on the risk, both of the country as well as the project. Our cost of funding is essentially US Treasuries because we are a US government institution and a dollar-based institution. So essentially, we would take the equivalent length for a US Treasury, 10 or 20 years, for example, and add anywhere from 2.5 percentage points up to 5 or 6 percentage points, depending on the level of the risk. Clearly, in the case of South Africa, it would be on the lower end of the scale, whereas, in some of the more risky markets on the continent, it would be somewhat on the higher end of the scale. Beyond that, in this sort of a setting, it's very difficult to specify, the criteria exactly with regards to the pricing. I think it's fair to say our pricing is quite similar to that of the IFC or British International Investment or Proparco, some of the equivalent institutions that are involved on the continent. I believe that's most of the questions at least, but if there's anything that I missed, feel free.
Diplomat in this nation. I just wanted to thank you on behalf of our Taiwanese community in South Africa and actually on a broader sense, all the Taiwanese community on this continent. I wanted to thank you for making yourself available and also sharing with us what kind of resources or scheme that our Taiwanese community on this continent can try to take advantage of, and also try to advance our cooperation, further consolidate the friendship between Taiwan and the United States. I actually spent almost 12 years in the United States, so I continue to hold United States very dear in my heart. And also, I look forward to further working even more closely with your good government, also your embassy here. And on behalf of our Taiwanese community, if I may present to you something that we pride ourselves very much in, and something I'd also like to promote. It's a whiskey from Taiwan. We call it Kava. You can actually buy it in the local market here. So I hope you can enjoy it.
looking forward to more opportunity from your company. Thank you.